It's been a real pleasure to be here. I'm coming here as Tanya's intro, in exceedingly generous intro, suggested. I'm coming here as an outsider in sort of my view. It's my first time in Vancouver. I spent a wonderful day yesterday with Tanya and with Sarah Stevens at the Museum of Anthropology and at Simon Fraser University, and it's been really a wonderful opportunity for me to come and to meet all of you, to really invest myself a little bit in Erickson's work and the story of Erickson's practice in relation to, as Tanya outlined, some of the broader currents of global modernism, especially in the second half of the 20th century, office practices, especially collaborative and corporate practices. And, you know, my goal here is to paint a little bit of a picture of Erickson in that global context, and really to ask a series of questions that have come up for me in thinking about Erickson's work in relation to his contemporaries, in relation to both some of the firms that sort of came before him, and firms that were operating in some of the same contexts, and to ask questions about notions of authorship, of signature, production versus collaboration, questions of representation, of promotion of the work, and of the reputation and legacy of Arthur Erickson's work both then and now. And I should say at the outset, so thank you absolutely for everybody who has invited me here. I want to thank Matthew and Rana, thanks to Sarah and Tanya, thanks to UBC Sala and to the Arthur Erickson Foundation for giving me this opportunity to really kind of think through this work, hopefully now with all of you in a kind of extended way. So I want to start with the reason why we're all here, in some sense, with the reputation, sort of by acclamation, of Erickson as, Canada's most famous architect, Canada's greatest architect, or Canada's, most prominent architect, both nationally and internationally. And to just kind of start there as, the thing that immediately interested me in terms of questions of authorship, of the reception of the work. How was this... sort of my first question is really to do with the construction of that reputation and that legacy as sort of the most prominent architect in Canada. As you see here, Vancouver's master architect, and the notion of the master architect and its history as a set of concepts, especially through the 20th century, and the promotion of architects, singular architects, as master architects or master builders, and how Erickson kind of sits within that sort of history, rather famously, of course, by people like Peter Blake in this sort of book, The Master Builders. And so part of that for me is thinking about questions, terms that circulate around these sometimes difficult questions of authorship, terms like the genius, right, the signature of a kind of singular creative hand, or a term like genius that does also attach to Erickson's work in a lot of cases, right? He's often described as a genius. There are elements of his biography in which he describes sort of seeing himself, especially in his earlier years, or kind of self-styling as a genius, or of looking kind of more specifically at architects before him, particularly Frank Lloyd Wright, who certainly self-styled as a genius and was promoted as a genius, in a kind of tension between something like Taliesin, what you see in the photo, that shows the image of Wright at the center of a group, maybe cult is a strong word to use, but a sort of group of disciples or acolytes or kind of interpreters of his vision, versus the notion that he promoted of himself as a genius, and which was then promoted in turn by authors, critics, people who were assessing Frank Lloyd Wright's work and kind of took up that notion, and then which he promoted in books like Genius and the Mobocracy. Erickson and Wright have a particular sort of relationship. Erickson, of course, famously credits his decision to pursue architecture with seeing in Fortune magazine in sometime in the 1940s, an issue of Fortune magazine that featured Taliesin West, then new Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West, and then deciding, if that's what architecture is, I want to do architecture. That's what I want to do. And then later, Erickson, I think he had the idea in those years to go to Taliesin and to work with Frank Lloyd Wright. And he tells the story of going to Taliesin east, not west, meeting Frank Lloyd Wright there, spending a day there, and sort of this, there's a real sense, I think, in his biography of that's sort of the path not taken in a way. He's ultimately convinced not to, he goes back to McGill, and he is convinced by, his instructors at McGill not to go work for Frank Lloyd Wright and instead to stay at McGill, finish out the year. And he's told that he is in line for a series of travel scholarships that if he completes the year at McGill, he will receive. And indeed, he goes out on these travel scholarships, spends about the next 2 years traveling around the world. And then that becomes incredibly important to him. But he writes, and there's a quote about sort of what would have happened if he had worked for Wright. He says, "Sometimes there is a door you could have gone through that would have changed your life, and you are somehow rescued. The idea of peace and retreat at Taliesin was terribly attractive, but I believe now that you have to be in the thick of things. It might have taken years and years to recover if he had gone to work for Wright," in other words. And so I think that there's a kind of intelligence about that, what seems to me to be a recognition of the potential problems of putting yourself underneath a self-styled genius like Wright, and that might have been at odds with what ultimately were his own authorial impulses, just as Wright, I should say, chafed at the constraints of Wright's own relationship with his mentor, Louis Sullivan, which is really what the book Genius and the Modelocracy is about. It's about kind of a genius working for a genius and the kind of relationship between the two. And this was in the period when there was a lot of hashing out kind of in architecture world and architecture discourse of these questions about group practice, team-based practice, essentially, versus the notion of the singular producer of buildings. Very famously in texts like this one, Henry Russell Hitchcock, also a biographer of Frank Lloyd Wright, in this sort of text, The Architecture of Bureaucracy and the Architecture of Genius, kind of posing these dichotomies. And so this is partly what I've been interested in. And I thought the panel this morning was extremely illuminating and fascinating for me precisely in relation to those kinds of issues. And so, it's interesting to me, for example, and here's where I have another set of questions, that the project that both made Erickson's young practice and catapulted him and his collaborator, Geoff Massey, onto a national stage was very famously an extreme exercise, a kind of heroic exercise in collaboration and coordination, both within the office and across multiple architectural offices that they were coordinating at the time. This is, of course, Simon Fraser University, their competition-winning entry, where Erickson Massey, as the winning team, was tasked, because this was the instant university. It had to be built in an incredibly short period of time from scratch. And so Erickson Massey, as the winning team, was tasked with coordinating the planning, design, and construction of this massive university campus from scratch within 2 years by a consortium of the 4 runners-up. So it was Erickson Massey leading the next 4 firms that had placed in the competition, who each staked out different portions of the work and had to coordinate them, which is kind of, amazing thing to have to undertake. And each of which was assigned one of the major components of the campus. And so there you have Massey and Erickson. And in this complex, Geoff Massey, it seems, was the organizer, and Erickson the visionary or the designer, right? And so this is from Stauch, Nicholas Stauch, Erickson's biographer. Quote, "Geoff was the administrator. He went to all meetings and coordinated scheduling, surveying, and relations among the architects and contractors. He took the brunt of the criticism. Arthur, who hated meetings," and this will come back later, "focused on design materials and the architectural language of the buildings," end quote. And years later, Erickson openly described a similar structure at his firm after Massey and Erickson split, Arthur Erickson Architects, particularly with regard to gaining and conducting business around the firm's international commissions versus his desired role that he tried to stay in as a designer. And he's talking about kind of client relations here also. So this is Erickson, this is a quote. All this, the kind of building of the office and these commissions, has required years of intensive negotiations, but I have kept out of all that. I don't want to go to meetings, and I have no involvement until we start designing. I hardly know who works for me. It is a great disadvantage to a client, I suppose, that I'm not running the office or deciding who's employed, but each office has to be effective as a team. And this was trust was raised in the morning panel. My offices consult me on projects as much as possible, and I'm involved in all the design. That's what I enjoy. That's why I'm in it. That's why I'm hired. That's why clients want to hire him, is because of his design ability. And so there's a tension here, I think, between the image of Erickson as a singular author and, let's say, a perceived utility of that image, especially in gaining commissions, through this notion, and the collaborative nature of the office that's already been described. For his part, Erickson acknowledged this tension, and I think this is a typical kind of reciprocal relation in, for example, the Architects Collaborative with Walter Gropius versus the collaborative nature of the firm. And in other cases where there's often a very well-known singular person at the head of a larger group of people, where sort of each acknowledges the other in some fashion. So this is Erickson again. Quote, even before I set up my own firm, this is the introduction to his 1988 book. Even before I set up my own firm, I was perhaps too independent, too jealous of my design prerogatives. Those who are skeptical that one man could produce this body of work can take satisfaction in the back of the book, along with those who want to know how an architect really works. There you will find a list of project credits. Without the determination, sound instincts, and solid talents of these colleagues, my ideas would have all remained feeble sketches. But at the same time, Stauch in his biography quotes Eva in describing the office as consisting of, quote, 100 underlings who keep up the appearance that Erickson does it all, end quote. Right? So there's a kind of back and forth. This gets us, I think, into the complex subject of Erickson's claims of authorship over particular projects of the office, and conversely of his apparent habit of disowning certain projects, taking his name or his firm's name off of them, renouncing authorship, in other words, over commissions that were not realized according to Erickson's designs, or over which his office did not have sufficient control in their execution at later design stages. This is the case, for example, with the Al Sawaber housing development in Kuwait, to which I will return at the end of the talk in a lot more detail. Okay, Canada's master architect. So one project, I think very significantly, for which Erickson does not do that, does not renounce authorship, but actually claims it for something that's ultimately realized by other architects, is this one, the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal, where Erickson, all the way through, claims authorship over the initial design scheme, which then was sort of modified and then ultimately realized by others, but for which he feels it's important to kind of stake a claim over the ownership. Unlike other projects where the reverse takes place. And I think that that's significant in a way that it speaks to the primacy of this kind of commission in Canada at Expo 67 in Montreal for a then still young practice, kind of not, growing, let's say, practice with ambitions to more, in staking out a name for themselves, essentially. And specifically a name for themselves as part of the notion of Canadian architecture and Canadian identity. And so this is kind of what I want to dwell on in the second part of this, which is the relationship of these notions, of the notion of Canada, or sort of Canadian architecture, to this construction of the image of Erickson as a master architect. And so to quote from this Time magazine profile from 1972, the author wrote, Arthur Erickson has been showered with more acclaim and awards than any other Canadian architect before him. In an age of team design, he wrote, Arthur Erickson, at age 47, epitomizes the idea of the individual creator, the architect as superstar. This is 1967, which is very early moments to be using that kind of framing. Erickson's office, Erickson Massey still, right, so Erickson is already being described singularly, even though Erickson Massey is still together. Of course, designed their own pavilion, separate from the Canadian pavilion, but sort of part of the Canadian representation, Man and His Community, and a second pavilion kind of right next to it, Man and His Health, in wood frame construction. And there were a set of arguments about timber in relation to kind of Canadian identity and sort of Canadianness. that I won't go into terribly much, other than as a bridge to this project. So what I want to look at here is the construction in a way of this very strong affiliation between Arthur Erickson and his national, increasingly international reputation, and Canada and Canadianness, Canadian identity, right? This is consolidated through a series of corporate governmental projects and things like these expo pavilions, kind of, piece by piece, including, for example, Macmillan Bloedel, now known, of course, as Arthur Erickson Place, and his work for, in this case, one of Canada's major industrial corporations, BC's major lumber company. And this is, so in this sense, he starts to work for these kind of central, corporations in Canada. And I think it's good to remind ourselves that not only was Macmillan Bloedel Limited one of these corporations, but also Massey himself is from the family of another one of these corporations, Massey Harris, the farm equipment company, later absorbed into Massey Ferguson. And the family that includes, they're not directly in that lineage, of course, Vincent Massey, the first Canadian-born Governor General, etc., for whom I believe the Massey Prize is named, which Erickson Massey wins at some point. And so lumber and, timber, lumber and Canada, of course, come together in Erickson Massey's work significantly in the Tokyo International Trade Fair, another Canadian pavilion, even earlier than that in 1965. Here, Erickson says, quote, "My idea for a Tokyo Trade Fair building in 1965 was an obvious one, to represent Canada with a log cabin. The point was to be felt in the raw power of the very unfinished look of the wood. The building would just be piled up and crudely put together, but vigorous, like Canada." And so it's interesting to me that, Macmillan Bloedel on its face doesn't seem, although it is for this major lumber company, would not seem to be kind of about expressing the material of this company as, in relation to sort of a notion of its stature in Canada in any significant way. Rather, it takes on very much the techniques and kind of expression of an office building and the construction of a kind of good office environment. Erickson referred to this as his Doric building, uncompromising in its simplicity. He wrote about it as completely countering the impermanent jerry-built aspect of the modern office building, epitomized by hung ceilings and flexible partitioning on the inside and the curtain wall on the outside. He didn't like the kind of flimsiness and sort of multi-layered nature of this. And so with this building, he says, "We turned our backs on new technology and we went to the oldest and most traditional of techniques, the solid load-bearing wall with minimum openings cut into it." Despite this corporate image in concrete, Erickson did later describe Macmillan Bloedel as, quote, "a tapered, slender, tree-like form for the giant forest products company." So he does get there in some fashion, where he's linking the company's products with the building's form and expression in a more direct way. At the same time, he conceded he hedged a little bit on this. He says, quote, "The fact that the building is rather rugged in appearance and that it tapers upward like the trunk of a great tree is quite incidental, but nevertheless conforms to the image that Macmillan Bloedel wanted to project." So it's sort of having your cake and eating it too. And I think it's interesting to compare, him with his contemporaries. For example, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, SOM's headquarters for Weyerhaeuser, another major Pacific Northwest lumber company, within a few years of that. And the ways in which, this is, for example, much more directly expressive of the products and the kind of territory in which the company, does its business. And I think has a lot of features, both in the relationship between concrete and greenery, the kind of scaling and stepping back of elements, the terracing, the kind of horizontal skyscraper sort of horizontality of it, and otherwise in the kind of, certain expressive elements of it. I feel like if you showed me these two buildings and I didn't know who had done them, I might have said that this was the SOM building and this was the Arthur Erickson building. They're interestingly sort of the opposite way of what you would think. Erickson does pursue this kind of forest, architecture as in with the forest, sort of analogy more explicitly, I think, in the inner court of the Bank of Canada. So this is another in the progression of major sort of Canadian corporate and or governmental commissions. The next one is the Bank of Canada in Ottawa, which has this mirror glass curtain wall. And then on the inside, this, and I think these drawings are kind of amazing in speaking to the desire to really create this kind of forest landscape sort of on the interior, again, as a kind of Canadian, a specifically Canadian sort of thing. Again, relating this to the work of Erickson's contemporaries. And I was just talking with Eva on the way in about her time working for Roche Dinkaloo, though not, she said, on the Ford Foundation, but it kind of in a similar period. And which really served as a precedent for this model of the invention essentially of the atrium, especially the landscaped kind of greenery, sort of covered atrium in this period as a kind of late modern phenomenon. And it's clear to me that indeed Ford Foundation was a strong precedent for the Bank of Canada, not least in the fact that the Canadian Centre for Architecture in its Arthur Erickson archives has these slides that are labeled explicitly as Garden Atrium of the Ford Foundation precedent for the Bank of Canada, which suggests that Erickson's office, these are slides from Erickson's office, that he kind of knew about it. Okay, Erickson and Canada. Canada and Erickson. The Bank of Canada Commission came via Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister, of course, after 1968, but I believe at the time an MP and the leader of the Liberal Party, kind of on his way there. According to Erickson's biographer, and this is a quote, at a private dinner party hosted by Trudeau, Arthur had met Louis Rasminski, the governor, then governor of the bank, and that was what kind of led to the commission. Erickson and Trudeau, of course, were famously close and had a decades-long friendship. This is the two of them touring the Museum of Anthropology in 1976. Quote, Arthur, this is Stauck, his biographer, Arthur had known Pierre's younger brother, Charles, nicknamed Tip, as a gifted architecture student at McGill in the late 1940s, but Arthur and Pierre did not meet until the latter became prime minister in 1968 and convened a group of the country's leading artists for a dinner in Ottawa. Trudeau was intent on hearing their views about the country's national identity. This starts from the beginning. Erickson was the sole architect. The gesture of a politician turning to artists for advice seemed extraordinary, and Arthur's meeting with Trudeau was one of instant rapport. And there are subsequently lots of references to the two of them traveling all over the world. They traveled to China, Tibet, Saudi Arabia, many other places that have sustained friendship, genuine friendship over years, which matters, as we will see. And so to return to Expo 67 and how the Expo pavilions, for example, sit at this, what's starting to be, I think, a kind of a nexus of kind of Trudeau, the government, Erickson, sort of images of Canada, both nationally and, as we'll see, internationally. This is also the moment, I feel it is necessary to point out, when the notion of Canada itself as a unified nation, as a kind of, one thing, is, of course, itself under construction in a similar way. I do not have to remind anybody in this room. This is the moment of the redesigning of the Canadian flag. This is the moment of the birth of the centennial symbol to celebrate the century of after Confederation. I remind everyone, of course, also that Expo 67 included the Indians of Canada Pavilion, which, according to John Moses, Aboriginal Affairs Directorate for Canadian Heritage, quote, was one of the first opportunities during the latter half of the 20th century where Indigenous people are given a political voice and a separate, standalone, safe space within which to express themselves, not just to Canada, but to people around the world. And, this is also the moment, of course, in relation to Trudeau and Chrétien, very famously, this is the moment of the white paper, the statement of the Government of Canada on Indian policy, which is expressly the controversy, the huge controversy over this and the responses, for example, The Unjust Society by Harold Cardinal, among other responses, the Red Paper. The responses, both the text itself, are entirely around, the question of sort of, who is a part of Canada and Canadian identity versus sovereignty or independent land claims, right? I won't summarize the white paper here, other than to say that the whole issue was assimilation, right? Proposing to end the Indian Act and assimilate First Nations members as Canadian citizens, but by the same token, depriving them of any of their claims to independent sovereignty or land or reparative claims or other special rights, which First Nations had fought to gain through amendments to the Indian Act over the previous century. And so in this sense, Erickson's ambition to be an architect for all of Canada, to be Canada's master architect, I think is coupled to a very specific set of claims at the time about the nation and about who and what a Canadian is. Right? And this is, we can go back actually to sorry to back up a little bit. The framing, I should note that the framing of Expo 67, the kind of title that was put over the whole thing, of course, was Man and His World. And the pavilions that Erickson Massey designed are man in the community and man in his health. And so you can relate it to these questions of, even beyond Canada, whom did this humanist conception of a kind of universal man include? Whom did it exclude? And what, in other words, was a Canadian? This project of creating a Canadian expression continued now abroad with the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 70 in Osaka. And here's Erickson again. I feel like I'm quoting from Erickson a lot, but I just love these quotes. Quote, again, I faced the problem of representing Canada and at the same time capturing the attention of the mainly Japanese audience. I decided that one thing that could be interestingly presented was the emptiness and immensity of the Canadian landscape. I expressed this quality in very large, simple forms, 4 sections of a pyramid pulled apart to open a central court, abstractions of our landscape in size, emptiness, and simplicity. So again, sort of architecture trying to sort of evoke or mimic certain features of the Canadian landscape. This desire to create a feeling of emptiness, immensity, and infinitude, Erickson wrote, also produced this project of the mirror glass. Erickson wrote, it inspired me to sheathe the whole pavilion in mirrors. Its forms, now mountains of ice, would still work, and the mirror surface would bring down the sky. The sheathing gave a completely new meaning to the structure as something responsive to everything around it, so receptive that the building itself might vanish. To accomplish this, there could be no edge to the building, which meant that the mirror had to be detailed so that it merged with the sky. That one detail was the key to the whole thing. And that project of kind of an ever-changing kind of series of fleeting effects that conveyed a kind of, sort of infinity of changes, of course, continues on the interior, sort of in the middle of this court, with these revolving pavilion spinners by Gordon Smith. And then the Canadian Pavilion is very often on the cover of major architectural magazines in North America and in Europe in this period. And so there's something about its image was able to carry the image of Expo 70 at large in all of these reviews, Architectural Review and Architectural Record. And to kind of leap out of Erickson's specific history for a second, again, we can put this interest in mirror glass kind of more broadly within a great deal of interest among architects at the time in mirror glass. This is what's often described as late modern architecture. That's summarized in things like this. This is the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York in 1979, in their exhibition and catalog, Transformations in Modern Architecture, where they have a section on glass skins, on the kind of fetishizing of interest in mirror glass skins. And sure enough, as you would expect, Erickson's both Expo 70 and Thompson Hall are part of that kind of menagerie of examples at the time. And this, I had to throw this in after seeing this building yesterday, kind of fleetingly from the cab. I just thought, here's a building in Vancouver for the kind of same vintage in mirror glass. But that was featured in one of these ads for all of these increasingly elaborate techniques of mirror glass curtain walls in this period. Yeah. The representation of Canada abroad through architecture was, of course, also the central imperative of the Canadian Chancery in Washington, D.C., on a prominent site steps away from the U.S. Capitol and the National Mall. I should say I had the privilege of walking by this building pretty much every day for about 2 years when I was at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And this was the moment of working on the Canadian Chancery was, I think, the moment when this nexus that I've tried to lay out of Erickson, Trudeau, and the image of Canada internationally now famously came to a head publicly and very controversially. Again, I am sure everyone in this room is quite familiar with the story, but I will dwell on it a little bit because I think it speaks to these issues. The commission to design the chancery had been awarded to Erickson's office essentially directly and personally by Trudeau, by fiat, as it were. This was revealed in 1982 to great public scandal. And again, quoting Erickson's biographer at length, who describes it. A panel of civil servants and architects had met to examine some 300 applications for the commission and had narrowed the candidates down to a list of 11, which included Arthur, and then to a choice of 4, among which he no longer figured. He wasn't in the last list of 4. Although the committee's final selection was the firm of Zeidler and Roberts of Toronto, Prime Minister Trudeau directed his Minister of Public Works to award the commission to Arthur. Trudeau was denounced as Canada's Sun King, and Erickson characterized as the arrogant architecte du roi, the architect to the king. Trudeau soon issued a statement to the press implying that Arthur had been unanimously regarded by the panel as the best architect in Canada, all agreeing that Arthur Erickson stands out most clearly on the international scene as expressing Canadian architectural concepts. And I want to dwell on this last point a bit more, namely the idea that Erickson would be distinguished specifically for his ability to express Canadian architectural concepts. Stauch, the biographer, continues in his description of the means by which Erickson received the commission. Quote, Arthur had written a confidential letter to Trudeau on December 14th, 1981, when he learned from his old McGill classmate, Guy Desbarats, now part of the government, that he had not made the final shortlist for the Chancery Commission. Arthur appears to have typed the letter himself in secrecy, casting himself in the rare attitude of a supplicant. The Washington Chancery, he wrote, quote, is for me that rarest of opportunities to design a building of distinction, a place of renown on a site of high visibility and significance for this country of ours. Nothing in my career as an architect would be as worthwhile as the chance to make a Canadian statement in the American capital. And to quote from the letter in particular that Erickson writes a little bit more, Erickson writes to Trudeau, what is particularly galling to me is that I have done more to put our Canadian architecture into the world picture than any other architect in the country. For what the Canadian Pavilion of Osaka accomplished for the image of Canada abroad, for that alone, I would expect to be given a commission such as this. I would think that External Affairs would recognize my international stature in such an important diplomatic post in Washington. And when Erickson later, somewhat later than this, described how the architecture of the Chancery reflected all of these imperatives to put Canadian architecture into the world picture, here's what he wrote. Given the highly visible site and the importance of the Canadian-American relationship, the key design consideration was how to represent Canada appropriately. We could not flaunt some national distinction as we would in a completely alien country, for in the larger cultural picture, our countries were indistinguishable. In the end, I wanted the Chancery to express an image of Canadian reserve and good manners, coupled with a characteristic gesture of openness and invitation to affirm our similar heritages, and at the same time project an element of freshness and forgivable naivete. As for more specific readings, these will be found in the long horizontals that suggest the breadth of Canada, or in the ample courtyard with its light and spaciousness. In the middle, a large pool symbolizes our ocean limits, right? So there's, again, this attempt to analogize form to a certain kind of cultural identity in both indirect and more direct ways. I want to close this section with an addendum of sorts, I think, in Erickson's joint competition project with Kenzo Tange for a Canadian embassy in Tokyo, midway through the years that the Chancery work was going on in DC. In this case, and I'm going to quote Erickson again, the Chancery roof garden, so I should say Kenzo Tange is responsible for the tower. Erickson is responsible for the kind of sloped part of the Chancery itself. He writes, the Chancery roof garden, a sloping plain of maples, visually extends a small public park. I had always been interested in how the Japanese mind separated the realm of nature from that of man, the better to counterpoint them. I thought that using plants in an architectural way would challenge traditional conventions in Tokyo and be a marked demonstration of Canada's presence. I could give all the offices a pleasant prospect and at the same time figuratively carry the garden up onto the roof for a particular Canadian identity. And so I think the Chancery in DC, the Embassy project unbuilt in Tokyo, and the $1 billion kind of 5 square block California Plaza project in Los Angeles. This was the project that brought Arthur Erickson Architects to start a branch office in LA. I think these projects all give us a lens into Erickson's ambitions to international practice by this time and as that developed in the 1970s and 1980s. With regard to the LA office, Erickson wrote in this period that, quote, an American base offered 2 solid advantages. First, it could fight the dim ghost that shadows wide recognition of any American professional, South or North, who is not a resident of the United States. And as Philip Johnson stated to Edith Iglauer for her 1979 New Yorker profile of me, why does it keep doing that? It's a question of acceptance. Erickson's a Western architect, and what's worse, he's in British Columbia, which is a province of a province to us in the U.S. That's Philip Johnson, so feel free to vilify Philip Johnson as much as you want. And I should say also that it was this presence in LA and the LA office, of course, in California Plaza, that played a major role in the bankruptcy and eventual demise of Erickson's office, as everyone here knows quite well, and I will not dwell on it in any way, other than to mention the ways that the bankruptcy story, I think, is also in some ways related to Erickson's national and international reputation in a few ways. First, there is, as part of the kind of trying to save Erickson from bankruptcy, a series of kind of financial elites and kind of large corporate and other investors in Canada formed the Arthur Erickson Capital Group in 1988, specifically to kind of save, the hero of Canadian architecture from, the end of his office, right? And so there's a report of a meeting where they say to Arthur, right, quote, Arthur, you're our friend. We love you. You are Canada's national treasure as a designer, but you can't go on like this. And then there's also a story of Erickson's attorney, Richard Gordon, whom he had brought in to kind of put the firm on a sound financial footing, but in the meantime it left and was also suing Erickson, was quoted as saying of Erickson, he's a very self-destructive man. It's a black eye for Canada. So I just want to point out, that even in the kind of bankruptcy story, there is this fusion is pretty tight by this time of Canada, what it means for Canada kind of on an international stage, as that tracks with the fortunes of Erickson's office. But it was to the Middle East, really, that Erickson's global ambitions beyond North America extended, in particular in these decades. And this was, right, this is kind of very dramatically in North American architectural press, talked about as the oil-rich Mideast, the new frontier for professional services, with all of these kinds of questions about, it was seen as a risky, but sort of potentially very lucrative, kind of full of potential territory for a huge number of architects who were really trying and competing to work in that context, in the MENA region, in the Arab and Persian Gulf in particular. Questions like this: is this the new client, right? Or the notion there is no one market. And these are some more images of, there was a huge amount of press, and I've written at length about this elsewhere, about, things like this. You can extend this from America to North America, North American designers in Arabia, and a series of offices like TAC, already mentioned, the employees of which I should note were called tacos, or TAC office members are called tacos. Working very heavily, had a branch office in Kuwait, executing projects all over the Middle East, as were firms like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, SOM, some of which you see here, Just the Towers, among a great many projects, firms like CRS, Caldwell, Rowlett Scott, generally corporate, quite large practices at the time. And it was in this market that Erickson's office was kind of seeking to compete and sort of, stake a foothold. Erickson's work in the MENA region is at the very least often under discussed among his body of work, if not obscured or dismissed entirely. This work, for example, does not appear at all in Olsberg and Castro's critical works. It just doesn't appear. There's not mention of any of the Middle East work. And it only bears a passing appearance, for example, in Iglauer's Seven Stones, where the projects in the Middle East are invoked mainly as examples of unrealized schemes and kind of as pretext for Erickson's bitterness. I mean, he only has a few quotes that are like quite bitter in a way that doesn't really, he never says anything to that effect otherwise about the failures of some of these commissions or the fact that they were unbuilt or the difficulties working with clients in the Middle East. The work is given a full chapter in Stauck's biography of Erickson, but, and I think this is all too typical among the histories of most of these Western architecture firms who are working heavily in the Middle East in this period, like TAC or SOM, the Middle Eastern work is relegated here, I think, to an essentially tragic position as a kind of harbinger of overreach or of folly and sort of eventual financial ruin and demise for these Western firms, many of whom, so the story goes, were lured by never realized promises of riches to be gained, as globally famous architects working in newly oil-rich countries. And so you can see in Stauck's book, this is just how the Middle East chapter appears, halfway between celebrity and bankruptcy, right? Celebrity, the Middle East, bankruptcy. Even though this was not, and Stauck acknowledges it in the book, this was not really a primary reason for the demise of Erickson's office in any sense, but it kind of somehow in the narrative, one might get that impression. This dismissal or inattention is very different, I think, from how Erickson himself described his firm's work in the Middle East in this period. The only monograph on Erickson's work to give dedicated attention to these projects is the one written by Erickson himself. This is The Architecture of Arthur Erickson, particularly the second edition from 1988, which devotes one of its 4 sections fully to describing the work in the MENA region and in the Middle East, specifically at length. This is the section titled Counterpoint, Other Ways of Seeing. This work was often also promoted in office brochures produced by Arthur Erickson architects like this one. In this case, in the case of this office brochure, for example, the Middle Eastern work is given its own section. The rest of the office brochure is organized by building type, essentially. So, hospitals, housing, cultural commissions, etc. The only part of the office brochure that's organized by geography is this one for Middle East projects. So you could tell that they were really advertising and trying to gain commissions, essentially, in the region. But it's an extensive body of work, so much so that in 1999, the Canadian Architecture Collection at McGill produced this a book basically chronicling the quantity of material in the CAC collection, the JV CAC collections. I think, and David can correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are 24 projects in total, something like that. But, it's an extensive archive, and the archive is at the CAC and is worth examining. And so I want to go to Erickson's own description in this counterpoint chapter of his monograph, vis-a-vis the reasons why a lot of these North American and European and other increasingly large architecture firms were working competitively in this context. I want to dwell a little bit on what Erickson says about his reasons for being there. This is the beginning of the section. Quote, "The reasons that a foreign developer or public corporation might have for hiring a North American architect are not the same as what I might have for responding. The client may be attracted by North American leadership in design or command of modern building techniques, or he may want some one thing an architect has done for him. Published projects become specialty advertisements, and the client in effect might be seeking merely a prosaic offhand variation on an architect's Western building. For myself, on the other hand, while the opportunity to work abroad is undeniably a call to my inherently restless nature, given that foreign commissions are scarce, grueling to serve, and financially extremely risky, how can they be rational business choices? The deeper appeal lies in the match of creative wits with an utterly different physical and cultural environment." And so, he says essentially he's there, this is right, he's pursued his muse through these contexts, that he's there because of what it means for him to have to think very differently about work. But at the same time, he was not blind to the potential economic benefits. And elsewhere in the text, he says, opening up a new field of prospects in the Middle East fit well with a business strategy that grew out of my experience with Canada's regional economies. When it was busy in the West, it was slack in the East, and vice versa. The only way I could guarantee a steady flow of sustaining projects was by having an office in each. And this was, again, very, very common for firms like TAC or SOM or CRS. And so I think there were authorial and business interests that were kind of bound together in a reciprocal loop for Erickson. The entry point for Erickson's office in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia was through Erickson's travels to the Middle East, first as a student, then with his partner, and later with Pierre Trudeau. According to his biographer, in February 1967, he traveled to the Middle East to share the experience with Francisco, his partner, and shortly afterwards he sent for a list of government projects he might compete for. Before the year was out, he had submitted a proposal for the university city of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. This was followed in March 1968 by a series of letters that went through the Canadian embassy in Beirut, exploring the possibility of a contract to build Kuwait University, or KU. And in pursuing these university commissions in Kuwait and Riyadh, Erickson's calling card was Simon Fraser University, the success of which he claimed had in fact originated in the Middle East, that's a quote, by being modeled in large part on Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, site of possibly the world's oldest university. For Erickson, Al-Azhar served as a model of, quote, a philosophy of education in which all knowledge was related and all its seekers were members of one community, end quote. And Al-Azhar had figured even earlier already in Erickson's thesis as an architecture student at McGill, which was focused on university architecture. And he later described it this way. He said, the broad, non-directional space of Cairo's Al-Azhar University Mosque, where students, merchants, and beggars sat or lay on the carpeted floors, listening, praying, reading, or just sleeping, served as a model not just for Simon Fraser, but also at Lethbridge University as well, for the notion of a kind of unified campus that was not making distinctions between different academic programs. Kuwait University never happens, nor does the university in Riyadh, but he proposes two others. Later, King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah and the Islamic University of Medina at Al-Madina in Saudi Arabia. Like other architects who sought to practice in the MENA region in this period, Erickson developed his own kind of generalized universal theory, quite a personal theory of Arab architecture, that tended to subsume differences among its many different geographies or caliphates, time periods, etc., which was quite unlike, I should say, the nuanced chronological and contextual theory of the Western architectural tradition that he had sought to develop during his travels as a student, where he kind of goes in reverse chronological order from the Levant to the Mediterranean and to Northern Europe, specifically in that order. And so in Erickson's conception, all Arab architecture, kind of full stop, was based on an abstract language of pure form and geometry, and on an architecture of solid walls as the essential structure of the Middle East, as defenses against the desert and as creators of privacy, particularly in dwellings. Structures that did not conform with this theory, even a canonical Islamic masterwork like the Alhambra, he regarded as luxurious and decadent because in this case, its exterior did not highlight essential forms like the square, the octagon, and the circle. And I think you can see in Erickson's later work here some of this theory kind of being actuated. These cultural and regional theories would inform the work of Erickson's office in one of the primary territories in the Middle East for the work of foreign architects in this period by the end of the 1970s. This is in Iraq and specifically in Baghdad under Saddam Hussein in this period, 1979 to 1983. Here, Erickson formed part of a second boom of North American and European architects gaining major international commissions in Baghdad and elsewhere. In Iraq, this is Erickson's project, which we'll see in a moment, is a redevelopment, this Abu Nawas Conservation Development Project, but it's in the context of many other major redevelopment projects. For example, this is Khulafa Street. This is TAC, this is the Architects Collaborative spearheading this. Arab, Test, lots of other firms that are staking out, pretty large portions of the city that are being given these commissions, redevelopment commissions by the government. This formed, so this was, I've described it as the second wave of development. It followed a first wave of involvement of North American and European architects in modernization projects for a newly oil-rich Iraq after the 1950s, including work by Frank Lloyd Wright, the Architects Collaborative, or TAC, and unbuilt proposals by Alvar Aalto, Le Corbusier, Gio Ponti, Willem Dudok, and many others. And so by the time of the second building boom, when Erickson arrives under Saddam Hussein, these architects are working in a context of state planning, kind of state-led planning and architecture firms from socialist countries on the one hand, and of ongoing work from the previous booms like TAC's University of Baghdad. Here is Abu Nawas. I won't go into it in a ton of detail. It's a redevelopment proposal that has kind of a waterfront, like a corniche, with a series of what were described as pleasure gardens, kind of, public gardens with sort of major civic buildings, and then a kind of urban redevelopment that sort of lies behind it. Here you can see something of the character of this. One of the things that's interesting for me about this scheme is that there were two alternate schemes that were somewhat more fanciful, one of which proposed essentially enclosing or sort of redesigning the central street, Abu Nawas Street, as a river, essentially, or as a kind of canal, and then basically making this into a kind of large kind of landscaped island. And then a second kind of even more fanciful proposal that would have had an island with a kind of, civic kind of cultural buildings in the center, but that included a bridge that would have gone across to Saddam's palace in the green zone. And Erickson said that this scheme, the water garden scheme, the one on the left, for example, was bolder after President Saddam Hussein's suggestion to follow the 8th century example of Caliph al-Mansur, the founder of modern Baghdad. This is the round city of al-Mansur. In a tumultuous time for his country, the president wished to remind the citizens of their golden age, which was commonly regarded as that. I needed little encouragement. And so it's in this sense that I think Erickson, again, we can relate back to people like Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright made exactly the same allusions and references in Baghdad in his plan for Greater Baghdad, circa 1957. Rounded forms, islands, sort of civic islands with public landscape spaces and major civic buildings. Erickson was well aware of Wright's scheme and said that specifically, that he was quite interested in it as well. And just to kind of bring the point home about the context in which he was working, this is an international conference on architecture that was specifically centered on the Abu Nawas kind of redevelopment, where there's Erickson presenting, there's Saddam, there's Rifat Chadirji, the planner for the city of Baghdad, who had been imprisoned and was pulled out of prison by Saddam, sort of, working in this context. And these kind of orientalizing references to the kind of glories of the round city of al-Mansur, etc. The Abbasid period was very much sort of propagated by Saddam Hussein himself. All right, I will try to speed up, I guess, just to get to the last part quickly to have more time for the Q&A. But I want to point out that this sort of somewhat uncomfortable position of Erickson's office vis-a-vis their clients, let's say their government clients, working in some of these national contexts, is also, I think, reflected in the way that he advertised or even described some of the projects that he does subsequently in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia he describes as the prized client, but difficult to obtain for a relatively unknown architect without a corporation behind him. For example, this one, the Ministry of Air Defense Headquarters, also sort of an unbuilt project, but which in Erickson's monograph, he describes simply as an administrative headquarters, right? So I think you can tell there's a kind of an awareness that, maybe working on military commissions in Saudi Arabia is a bit, the description of that is a bit tricky. Or the Royal Saudi Air Force Complex, also unbuilt, which similarly is described only as a technical university. You never find out who the client is, kind of in the way that Erickson promotes this work. The loop closes, or there was an attempt to close the loop a little bit in Erickson's design, also unbuilt, for the Saudi Arabian embassy and ambassador's residence in Ottawa. So it's sort of, it kind of comes back. One But by and large, all of the work that I'm showing you it remains unbuilt. Most of it does not come to fruition. The only things really which Erickson kind of claims later authorship over as built work are two towers quite similar to each other for Etisalat, for the telecom company in the UAE, one in Dubai and one in Abu Dhabi, as you see here. Okay, the last part, I will try to move quickly. This is only about one project, so it will be somewhat quicker. Okay, so to return in this context to Kuwait and to the project I showed you way back at the beginning, the Al Sawaber project, which was Erickson's first actual commission in the Middle East. According to Erickson, the Sawaber project was an important break for us and led to even larger urban projects in Kuwait and Baghdad, which was indeed the case, even though none of them were built. This was, again, Kuwait was the context of, like Iraq, a country that was newly wealthy based on petroleum and petroleum exports, and which dedicated a huge percentage of this new income to modernization projects, in addition to infrastructural projects, to urban planning, architecture. Generally, foreign architects were invited in to radically reshape, in this case, Kuwait City. Kuwait City, the old town, what you see in the lower left and the kind of top part of this master plan by Minoprio, Spenceley, and McFarlane, the same master planners of Baghdad in a couple of years prior, in its kind of modernization schemes, essentially kind of demolished and evacuated kind of large portions of the old town in favor of the construction of these ring roads around which Kuwaiti citizens were subsidized to build basically villas, kind of large kind of housing estates for themselves. And this is something of what the old town kind of looked like at the outset of something which turns into, again, a kind of, in a way, the major building boom in the Middle East for a certain period of time, in one city at least, in Kuwait City, and which involved a huge number of foreign architects, so much so that you get, and this is typical, this is one of many articles, this kind of reportage from outside, in this case in Middle East construction, of Kuwait City as a showplace for the world's architectural prima donnas. And so this is the context in which Erickson is also trying to build in Kuwait. This is Jorn Utzon. This is John Donington, who's a British architect. Architects from all over, including very significantly the Architects Collaborative and SOM and others. And I want to point here, again, to go back to the Trudeau, Erickson, and the kind of, Canada abroad sort of nexus. There, in seeking this work or seeking a presence in Kuwait, there were reciprocal relations between Erickson's self-promotion and business and the promotion of Canadian interests abroad in this competitive market context. And so I think you could argue in some sense that Erickson and his practice by this time had themselves become key Canadian export products. Erickson's image, in some sense, was a Canadian export product. In other words, advertisements of Canadian design and industry and of Canada's modernity, certainly in architectural terms, that could be promoted to other governments and to foreign clients. These export products, in turn, could pave the way for new markets and trade relationships for Canadian businesses, and they encourage sympathetic exchanges in Canada's foreign relations. And I do not have the quote here, very sadly for me, but there's Erickson, when he's going to Kuwait, for example, he writes a letter back to Trudeau where he's essentially advocating for Canada to expand its international relations and commerce with Kuwait from state to state, both as a way of kind of helping Erickson out. But he says basically to Trudeau, Kuwait is a very good place for Canada to do business, and therefore you should kind of encourage these relationships. So I think the exchanges go in both directions, in other words. It's not just kind of asking the government for favors. To talk about the Sawaber project a little bit, and then, I will be at the close. The project that was the sort of charge that was given to Erickson was essentially to design a housing complex that would bring newly wealthy Kuwaitis, kind of Kuwaitis of means or elite Kuwaiti citizens, back to the city center rather than sort of villa expansion out in the periphery, and to make denser kind of housing appealing to sort of upper class Kuwaitis. This was one of a number of experiments, similarly, with new housing types that would be attractive to kind of elite Kuwaitis in this period, including Tak Suqa Wataniya, kind of nearby. This is the project that resulted on quite a large site that had been sort of fallow, and in which Erickson proposed a landscape that would go over an existing cemetery and then a series of these kind of quasi-megastructural housing blocks that were essentially, he described them as stacked villas, essentially. Each one, as we'll see, was they were quite luxurious. That would be sort of in these terraced stacks that would be back to back in order to create a shaded kind of public thoroughfare with a series of community functions that would be both within each one of these spines and then in the spaces between them with these kind of covered winter garden type things, quite dramatic. This is Erickson's rendering on the Erickson office rendering on the left of what that was intended to produce. And with windows oriented for privacy, sort of respecting the precedence of these dwellings as essentially private types. And in this, of course, this kind of A-frame, sort of quasi-megastructural A-frame, of course, had lots of precedents that Erickson, I think, was drawing on. Kenzo Tange, his sort of famous project for Boston Harbor, done while he was teaching at MIT with MIT students in 1952. Contemporaneous examples like the Golden Mile complex in Singapore that was also sort of meant to be a prototype for larger kind of megastructural expansive ambitions for Singapore. But then, of course, closer to hand for Erickson, precedents like Safdie's Habitat 67, especially the first scheme, the original scheme, not even beyond what was built, that was very much in line with this. And Erickson extended the prototype or the attempt later past Al Sawaber in the Medina Hotel project in Saudi Arabia, where it's kind of simplified and the top part of the units kind of touch to create like a kind of full megastructure kind of in miniature. As I said, this was the target market for this were upper class, basically Kuwaitis, who were being given subsidies or supported quite generously by the state, still are, if you're a citizen. And so they were, the typical apartment size, for example, was for a typical, what he decided or writes in the report is a typical Kuwaiti family size of 2 adults, 3 children, and a maid, who are all living in this kind of situation. So they're quite big. You can see from the rendering, I mean, they're very luxurious, right? So it was meant to kind of provide an entirely new image for this sort of housing. Okay, so what happened to Al Sawaber? So this is Erickson's description. In the Middle East, much is projected, much less realized. For all the creative energy I've invested, only a temporary structure in Saudi Arabia and a single tall building, that's the Etisalat building in one of them in the UAE, have so far seen the bright light of the desert day. Right. And so he writes about Sawaber as kind of, again, one of these lamented unbuilt projects. It is similarly described or noted in the CAC archive, the kind of description of the project you see at the bottom in the comments. The project was not executed. The design and documentation were not completed. That's the kind of, so it sits with all these other projects kind of in this legacy of a kind of, quite ambitious or heroic megastructural proposition that was not realized. Okay, so far so good. But it was built. I've been there. And this was one of my entry points, actually, in the invitation to come here, was having been in the buildings at Al Sawaber while I was working on TAC and other things. This is the state of what was built as it existed by the 2010s. So something was built, but not built by Erickson's office. And so this is a case where Erickson's office disowned the project. They took their name off of it because it was not realized according to their original intentions. This is Erickson's quote. Unfortunately, the government lost sight of its original objective when it put the project out to bid. As a result, only the unique outline was vaguely ours, and no Kuwaiti of means, no kind of elite Kuwaiti, upper-class Kuwaiti would live there, right? And so he describes the project as a failure in its occupation or inhabitation, and that's a result of not having built it to the intentions of Erickson's office. And indeed, it's a very charged site. At the period when I saw it, the buildings had been evacuated of their inhabitants by the state in advance of demolition, in advance of a planned demolition. And so they sat there kind of fallow, empty for years. And that's when I kind of toured, it was like this, with sort of everything kind of awaiting a demolition, which, people didn't know whether it was going to come or not. As of the mid-2010s. But indeed, they were demolished. This is a photo kind of demolished, very interestingly, I think they just sort of toppled over the buildings. This is an aerial view. In a way that was commemorated, for example, by artist Dana Rashid on the demolition of Al Sawaver, kind of, I love this image. And so this is kind of where I want to leave us, is in this comparison between, in this case, the projected and the realized, the reception or the kind of promotion of the work in the beginning, the notion of disowning a project, even though it was built, but sort of claiming it was unbuilt, and all of the, I think, sort of tricky authorial questions that obtain in that kind of scenario, the international ambitions of Erickson's office in relation to a kind of, Canadian abroad, sort of Canada's master architect abroad. This is an article by Asil Al-Regam that was written at the time of controversy over whether the complex would be demolished or not. The buildings were still standing at that point, that argued, as you see here, that it was the Al Sawaber project was not a design failure in her history of it. And it wasn't a failure in design intent, either for Erickson or even necessarily in its realization. It was really, she gives a whole series of other reasons, changes to the original design that thwarted the development of a vital and self-sufficient community, the absence of an administrative union, in other words, lack of maintenance, as a kind of common problem, economic greed that led to illegal subdivisions, land speculation, all of these things kind of changed the nature of the thing over time. But she was writing in a period where these buildings were empty, that there was a strong push, especially for a younger generation of Kuwaitis, to reoccupy the city center in denser urban arrangements that were exactly what the state had projected as a kind of desire, decades earlier. And so this is, I think, a good kind of place to leave it in this, the tensions that you can read out of a project like this, where in some sense for me, all of these things come home to roost in terms of these tensions in authorship, in international practice, and ultimately in the legacy of work that Erickson produced and that we are thinking about today. Thank you.